The stars stretched out in every direction like an endless ocean of fire, and yet for all their light, there was only silence, a silence that pressed down on every human ship drifting between the colonies, as if the very universe was holding its breath. For weeks, the colonies on the edges of human space had gone dark one by one. At first, it was dismissed as communication failures. After all, space was vast, and signals were fragile. Sometimes, solar storms cut transmissions, sometimes entire. Relay satellites fell out of alignment. But this was different because the silence spread too quickly and too perfectly. On the colony world of Rhinor, the settlers were simple people, miners and farmers, who lived under two suns. They had sent their last message out on a channel filled with screams and static, the words only half clear, but enough to freeze the blood of anyone who heard them. The last sentence came from a mother holding her child in her arms, her voice broken as she cried out, "They are not here to conquer us. They are here to erase us." When that message reached Earth, command the room of generals and ministers fell silent. No one spoke for several long minutes until one man asked the question that weighed on every heart. Who are they? The answer came soon after the Veyrith Dominion, an empire older than humanity, an empire that had burned 100 civilizations before. Now, their fleets had entered human space without warning, without demands, without offers of surrender. And they were not taking slaves. They were not seizing territory. They were killing every living thing and turning planets into ash. The reports grew worse each day. Refugee ships limped into the core systems, carrying survivors whose eyes were empty. They spoke of fire raining from the sky, of soldiers who did not speak, who did not hesitate, who slaughtered even children. One man from the colony of Brantha said he had watched his entire town lined up and burned alive by weapons that left nothing. But black shadows burned into walls. The governments of Earth tried to keep calm. They tried to hide the truth, but the truth was louder than any lie, because every day fewer signals came from the colonies and more refugees arrived with horror carved into their faces. The silence of the stars was not peace. It was death crawling closer with every passing hour. In the dark halls of the Terran Council, men and women argued endlessly. Some said humanity should surrender before they lost everything. Others said negotiation was impossible with monsters who did not speak. Some demanded the military act immediately, but the military had never faced a foe like this. The fleet was strong by human standards, but compared to the vast Veyrith armadas, it was nothing more than a candle in a hurricane. Admiral Kalen sat in his office, staring at the map of the stars. Little red lights marked human colonies, and one by one they flickered and died. He had seen war before. He had seen millions perish in the old Earth conflicts. But this was something different. This was extermination. There would be no prisoners, no survivors, no chance of peace. Humanity stood at the edge of a knife. And on the other side was extinction. And yet, in the silence before, the storm, something ancient stirred in the human heart. The first sparks of defiance began not with the generals, but with the survivors. A group of miners from Rhinor hijacked an old freighter and rammed it into a Veyrith warship, tearing it in half. Before it could fire on a refugee convoy, the recordings of that act spread like wildfire across human space. People whispered of it in bars, in bunkers, in the cold night of frontier moons. If simple miners could strike back, perhaps all of humanity. Good, but the silence still grew. The Veyrith fleets moved like shadows, precise, efficient, merciless, on the colony of ardent prime. The night sky burned with falling fire as orbital bombardments rained down. Entire continents turned to glass, the last. Transmission from Ardent was a single phrase whispered by a dying officer into a broken radio. They do not see us as people, only as pests to be erased. The words echoed through every channel, every network, every mind on Earth. The silence of the stars was no longer empty, it was filled with fear. And yet in that fear, something darker was born. On Earth, in hidden bunkers deep below the surface, old projects were awakened weapons sealed away for being too dangerous, too inhuman. Now dust was wiped away. From steel doors, codes whispered into forgotten machines, and engineers who had long prayed never to see their work used were called back to duty. Humanity had always feared its own creations, and now those creations would be sharpened into blades. Silence before the storm pressed heavier still. Earth's skies looked peaceful. Children still played in the parks. People still walked the crowded streets. But above them the stars were dying one by one, and humanity's leaders knew that soon the storm would arrive at the very heart of the homeworld. Admiral Kalen stood before the council, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with steel. They do not want peace. They do not want slaves. They want us gone. Every man, every woman, every child erased from history, and if we do nothing, we will vanish like the others. But if they want monsters, then monsters we shall become. The council chamber fell silent, not with fear, but with realization. The time of hesitation was over. Humanity would not wait for the storm to swallow them. They would rise into it, clawing and burning with everything they had. Across the colonies fleets were gathered, weapons, armed soldiers trained, and though they knew the odds were impossible, though they knew the Veyrith had crushed empires far greater than humanity, they also knew one truth. Humanity had always been at its strongest, when standing on the edge of the abyss. The silence before the storm was nearly over, and when the storm broke, the stars themselves would remember. The fires of the colonies still burned in memory. The silence of the stars was no longer a mystery. It was a warning. The Veyrith had come not to conquer, not to enslave, but to erase, and every man, woman, and child on Earth felt the weight of that truth pressing on their chests like a cold hand in the dark. Humanity had always been divided, nations pulling in different directions, each one seeking its own power. But the Veyrith had changed that in a single stroke, because the enemy did not care about borders or flags. They did not care who was rich or poor, who was soldier or farmer. They saw only one thing: humanity, and in their eyes, humanity was vermin to be destroyed. The council chambers on Earth echoed with voices raised in fury. Leaders who had once fought bitterly now argued for survival. Some shouted for surrender, others demanded retaliation. But all knew one truth: the old way of thinking was dead. If they did not unite, they would all die screaming in the cold. It was Admiral Kalen who stood in the center of that storm, his voice steady, his presence like iron. His words carried not just to the council, but to every listening ear across the homeworld. We must bury our rivalries. We must cast aside our fears. The Veyrith believe we are weak. They believe we will scatter and fall, but they have made one mistake. They have given us no choice but to stand together. And so for the first time in centuries, Earth was no longer fractured by nations. The Terran Defense Accord was born, forged not in trust but in desperation. Yet in that desperation was strength. Ships from rival fleets were merged into a single armada. Weapons hoarded by jealous governments were shared with trembling hands. Factories that once built tools of industry now roared day and night, building machines of war. Still whispers haunted the halls, because everyone knew humanity's fleet, even united, was small compared to the endless legions of the Veyrith the Dominion had crushed. Empires larger than the Terran Accord with ease. And so the leaders turned to shadows. They turned to the hidden places humanity had locked away long ago. Beneath the mountains of old Earth, in bunkers sealed for generations, doors of steel were opened. Dust falling from forgotten machines. Projects once deemed too dangerous, too inhuman, were awakened. Scientists who had prayed their creations would never be used were summoned back into the light with orders that could not be refused. Among those weapons was Project Revenant, a program designed to reforge soldiers into something more than human, stripped of fear, filled with enhancements that blurred the line between man and monster. Another was Project Black Sun, a fleet of stealth ships, invisible to most sensors, each one armed with weapons that could burn a city to ash from orbit. There were nanite clouds programmed to devour metal from within, viruses tailored to alien DNA weapons, born of fear now reborn in rage. The whispers spread. Across the fleet, among the soldiers and the civilians alike, they said humanity was preparing to fight, not as humans, but as demons. They said that soon the Veyrith would learn the price of calling them vermin. But unity was not only forged in steel, it was forged in grief. The refugee camps on Mars and Luna overflowed with survivors, men and women who had lost everything, children who had seen their worlds burned into glass, and among them hatred grew like a fire. They volunteered in waves lining up outside military stations, begging to fight, to take revenge, to become the blade that would cut into the heart of the enemy admiral. Kalen walked among them, sometimes his uniform drawing salutes and stares, but he did not see soldiers. He saw ghosts. He saw eyes that had watched everything they loved destroyed. He saw hands that trembled with rage more than fear, and he knew that these were the true weapons of humanity, not the ships, not the guns, but the unbreakable will to endure. In the shadows, plans took shape, whispers turned into actions. The first missions were prepared. Not grand battles, not open war, but strikes in the dark, small fleets armed with stealth and silence, sent to hunt the hunters, to bleed the Dominion in. Ways they had never imagined. Kalen told his commanders, "We cannot meet them head-on. We will never outgun them. But we can outthink them, we can outlast them, and we can make them fear the dark." In the corridors of power, scientists debated ethics, generals debated strategy, politicians debated survival, but among the common people there was no debate. There was only determination. The Dominion had made one mistake. They had shown humanity what it meant to face extinction, and humanity would not go quietly into the night. And yet beneath the roar of factories and the marches of soldiers, there was still fear. No one knew if unity would be enough. No one knew if the weapons hidden in the shadows would truly change the tide. But in every corner of the echoed the same phrase, spread like fire: "If they want monsters, then monsters we will become." On the eve of the first strike, humanity gathered in silence across every world, every station, every ship. Men and women looked to the stars, not with wonder, but with fury. The silence before the storm was over. The shadows had stirred, and in those shadows, humanity was waiting, ready to strike, ready to become the nightmare the Veyrith had unleashed. The storm was coming, but this time, humanity would not face it as prey. They would face it as predators. The Veyrith Dominion believed the pattern would never change. They would arrive in overwhelming numbers. They would erase resistance. They would leave behind only silence and ash to mark another empire, extinguished. And at first humanity looked no different. Fragile fleets, scattered colonies, burning, desperate voices begging for help. But then the silence changed. The first strike came in the empty stretch of space near the border system of Theros, a place the Dominion used as a staging ground. Their patrol fleet of 5 warships moved with the same cold precision as always, shields active, weapons charged, scanning for human refugees to exterminate. But on that night, there was something else. In the dark, something their senses could not see. The human stealth ship Revenant drifted like a ghost, her hull painted black, her systems designed to vanish from enemy eyes. Inside, her crew waited in breathless silence, hearts pounding as the Veyrith fleet drew closer. Admiral Kalen had chosen this mission carefully. It was not meant to save a colony. It was not meant to defend territory. It was meant to send a message. The Veyrith ships passed into the trap without hesitation, and in that moment, the shadows came alive. The Revenant launched her swarm of drones, tiny machines no larger than a fist, slipping past shields and burrowing into the alien hulls. Alarms blared across the Dominion fleet as systems failed, as engines sputtered, as weapons went dead. And then the drones detonated from within. 3 warships vanished in fire before they even understood what had struck them. The survivors fired wildly into the darkness, but there was nothing to see. No enemy ships on their scanners only. Shadows and whispers across comms, human voices broadcasting a single phrase over and over: "We are the monsters you made." The remaining Veyrith vessels tried to retreat, but the Revenant and her escorts moved with terrifying precision. Their weapons fired in silence, no warning, no mercy, one by one. The Dominion ships were torn apart until only debris remained, drifting in the void. The crew of the Revenant sat in silence, staring at the wreckage. They had done the impossible. They had drawn blood from a predator that believed itself untouchable. But more than that, they had planted fear. For the first time in centuries, Veyrith survivors returned to their commanders, not with victory, but with trembling voices, speaking of humans that moved, like shadows of ships that appeared from nowhere, of enemies that did not fight like prey, but like demons. The message spread faster than any fleet whispers, carried by terrified survivors. Stories told in half-broken words: the humans are not fighting. For survival, they are hunting us. On Earth and across the colonies, news of the strike spread like wildfire. The people who had lived only with fear now felt something else. Hope. The images of shattered Veyrith ships played again and again across every screen. Survivors of burned worlds wept with rage and joy as they saw their enemy bleed for the first time. Admiral Kalen stood before his commanders, his face grim, but his voice sharp. "This is how we will fight, not with numbers, not with strength, but with terror. We will strike from the shadows. We will make them doubt every corner of space. We will make them fear." The dark new fleets were prepared, more stealth ships, more drone swarms, more weapons that ate through steel like rot. Volunteers poured into the Accord military, not just soldiers, but engineers, hackers, scientists, every mind bent toward one purpose: survival through vengeance. But the Veyrith were not blind. They analyzed every wreck, every fragment. They tried to understand what they had faced, and the answers frightened them more than the losses. They realized humanity had chosen not to play the game of empires. They had chosen to change the rules, to fight like something beyond reason. In the Dominion High Council chambers, generals whispered of humanity as a threat unlike any other. They were too small to crush quickly, too wild to predict, too willing to use weapons. Even the Veyrith considered forbidden. Still, the Dominion pressed forward, confident that brute strength would prevail. But with every step deeper into human space, their fleets grew slower. More cautious crews, looking into the void with suspicion, as if shadows hid teeth. And in those shadows, humanity waited, on the frontier moon of Karsis, a Veyrith garrison, prepared to burn another human settlement. But before they could fire their weapons, the night came alive with strange lights, shadows moving through the air, then silence, and in the morning only bodies remained, every alien soldier dead, without a shot fired. The survivors spoke of whispers in the dark, of unseen figures tearing through their ranks like wolves through sheep. The Dominion had wanted monsters, and the Dominion had found them, back on Earth. Kalen stood alone in his office, staring. At the star maps, more red lights flickered, but now blue lights appeared as well, marks of victories, marks of vengeance. He knew humanity was still far from safe. He knew the Dominion could still crush them with overwhelming force, but he also knew something had shifted. The fear was no longer one-sided. The silence of the stars now belonged to both predator and prey. And somewhere deep within the shadows of the Accord, a new phrase spread from soldier to soldier, from ship to ship. A phrase whispered, not in despair, but in promise: we are the monsters in the dark. The first strike was complete. The war was no longer only about survival. It was about transformation. And in the black between the stars, the Veyrith had learned a truth that would haunt them. Humanity was not prey. Humanity was the nightmare they had unleashed. The first strike had changed everything. The Dominion no longer marched forward with blind confidence. Their fleets hesitated. Their commanders demanded reinforcements. Their soldiers whispered in fear, but humanity knew fear was not enough. Humanity knew survival would demand something darker, something terrible. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in bunkers older than living memory, steel doors opened and projects long. Forbidden stirred to life. These were not weapons meant for ordinary wars. They were nightmares built in silence, hidden away because even their creators had feared them. But now there was no choice. Because extinction does not allow mercy, Project Revenant was the first soldiers who had volunteered, were broken down and rebuilt their bones, reinforced their blood filled with machines, their eyes replaced with lenses that could pierce the blackest void, their minds sharpened by neural implants that stripped away hesitation and fear. The volunteers were not forced. They came willingly, men and women who had lost everything to the fires of the Dominion, who whispered, "Let me be the blade, let me be the monster you need," when the first revenant. Soldiers stepped from the laboratories. Even hardened generals turned away, their movements too precise, their eyes too cold, their voices stripped of human warmth. They saluted not as men, but as weapons waiting to be unleashed, and Admiral Kalen whispered to himself, "God forgive us." Next came Project Black Sun, fleets of ships coated in materials that bent light and energy, twisting sensors into blindness, each vessel armed with forbidden weapons, plasma so hot it could shatter a city in a single strike, gravity lances that tore ships in half without warning, weapons so terrible they had been locked away in fear of ever being used against humanity itself, now turned outward toward the stars. And still there was more. Project Veil, a virus, designed not to kill humans, but to unmake the biology of any who carried Veyrith DNA. Silent, invisible, it could spread with a single breath and end entire armies without firing a single shot. The scientists who had built it cried as they worked, begging the Council not to release such a thing. But the Council gave the order anyway, because mercy was gone. The whispers spread among the soldiers. They said the Accord was no longer fighting as humans. They said the commanders were building monsters to fight monsters, and still the volunteers came, thousands lining up, begging for enhancement, begging for vengeance. They had lost their families, their homes, their worlds. They had nothing left but rage, and rage was it. The first field test came on the burned world of Koran. The Dominion had turned its skies to fire and left garrisons behind to guard the ruins. The Accord sent not ships, not fleets, but revenant soldiers. Only 50 of them dropped into the ruins. At night, the garrison numbered thousands, but when dawn came, there were no Veyrith left, only silence. Only shadows, only stories carried by terrified survivors who had fled into the wastelands, stories of humans who moved faster than sight, humans who killed without sound, humans who fought like demons in the flesh. The Dominion High Council received those reports with disbelief. They said no species could fight like that, but the voices of survivors shook with terror. They said the humans were no longer human. They said the humans had become something else, and still Admiral Kalen carried the weight of it in his heart. He looked at the reports of victories, at the celebrations across the colonies, at the hope burning once more in the eyes of his people, and he wondered how much of their soul humanity had left to lose. He wondered if they were truly saving themselves, or only damning themselves to become the very monsters the Dominion had named them. But the war did not wait for answers. The Dominion responded with greater force, fleets numbering in the hundreds bearing down on human space, determined to crush the rebellion before it spread, and humanity answered not with retreat, but with fire. Black Sun ships striking from the shadows, tearing apart enemy armadas before they could even fire back, nanite swarms slipping past defenses and devouring ships from within until entire fleets dissolved into dust. The galaxy watched in shock, because for the first time in living memory, the Dominion was not sweeping aside another species. They were bleeding. They were being hunted by a race that should have been nothing more than prey, and the other civilizations who had once turned away in silence now whispered of humanity with dread. Because if they could do this to the Dominion, what else might they do? On Earth the celebrations grew, but so did the unease. Mothers looked at their sons returning from the front and saw strangers, eyes too sharp, voices too cold, men who no longer laughed, women who no longer cried, only soldiers who had been reforged into something alien. One soldier told his sister, "I am not your brother anymore. I am a weapon, and weapons do not come home." And still the war pushed forward the monsters within. Humanity growing stronger each day, the Dominion retreating step by step, but leaving behind destruction with every fall, whole planets reduced to ash, entire populations wiped out. Yet humanity endured their resolve, only sharpened by the fire. The Veyrith had wanted vermin erased, they had wanted a species forgotten. But what they had created instead was something far worse, a species that shed its own skin to survive, a species that embraced the darkness they had been thrown into, a species that now whispered together across every ship, every colony, every battlefield. If they want monsters, then monsters we will be. And in the shadows of the war, Admiral Kalen feared the answer to the question no one dared to ask: what would remain of humanity when the monsters they had created no longer needed the enemy to survive? For months, the Veyrith had pressed forward with fire and silence, believing that no matter what horrors humanity unleashed, it could never change the outcome. But slowly, the tide began to shift, because every time the Dominion struck, humanity struck back harder, faster, more merciless. On the burned ruins of Coron, the revenant soldiers proved that human flesh could become a weapon sharper than any blade on the shadowed edges of Theros. The Black Sunfleet proved that human steel could vanish into the void and strike like lightning. And across the stars, the whispers grew louder. Humanity was not dying. Humanity was hunting. The Dominion launched a massive offensive against the Accord's frontier fleet, a force of 200 warships, supported by carriers and troop transports. Their commanders expected to wipe away the fragile human line in a single strike. But when their armada arrived, they found only silence. The human fleet was gone. Sensors scanned empty space, and before confusion turned to caution, the shadows moved. Dozens of black sunships emerged like ghosts, their weapons lancing through the darkness, gravity beams tearing apart carriers. Before their fighters could launch plasma streams cutting through armored hulls like paper. At the same time, nanite swarms erupted within the Dominion warships. Alarms screamed as systems collapsed, engines failed, weapons jammed, crews drowned in fire from the inside out. By the time the battle ended, less than half the Dominion fleet remained, and those survivors fled in panic, leaving behind burning wrecks and silence. And for the first time in living memory, the Veyrith Dominion lost more than it won. The galaxy listened with disbelief when the report spread, because no one had ever forced the Dominion to retreat. Entire empires had been erased without leaving a scar, but humanity had bled the hunters and left their bones drifting in the void, and suddenly the myth of Veyrith invincibility was shattered across Earth, and the colonies, people cheered, screens showed burning alien wreckage, celebrations filled streets. Refugees who had once wept in silence now shouted with hope. The nightmare was not invincible. The monsters who had come to erase them could bleed, and if they could bleed, they could die. Yet in the shadows of victory, something darker stirred. The revenant soldiers returned from the battles, silent their eyes, cold, their movements precise, their humanity fading with each mission. One soldier whispered to a comrade, "I can no longer feel pain. I can no longer dream, only fight, only kill." And his comrade nodded without a word, because he felt the same. Admiral Kalen knew what was happening. He saw the victories, he saw the hope, But he also saw the cost. Humanity was no longer only fighting to survive. Humanity was changing each strike, each weapon, each act of vengeance carved away another piece of their soul, and still the war demanded more. On the frontier world of Veyrith, a Dominion garrison prepared to cleanse another human city. But before they could fire their bombardment, the revenants arrived only 30 against thousands. Yet when the smoke cleared, the city still stood, and the Veyrith were gone, not captured, not surrendered, gone torn apart in silence. The survivors said they had seen humans move like shadows through fire. They said they had seen men and women kill without a sound. They said the demons of Earth had come to save them. The turning tide was no longer a rumor. It was fact. The Dominion had lost hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, entire sectors stripped away by a species they had once dismissed as vermin, and fear began to rot their empire from within. Commanders questioned their orders, soldiers whispered of nightmares, entire fleets moved slower, hesitating at every shadow as if expecting human ghosts to rise from the void. The Dominion had once been the terror of the galaxy, but now terror had turned against them. Still, the Veyrith were vast, their numbers unending, their armadas stretching across the stars, and humanity knew that each victory came at a terrible price. Fleets stretched thin, soldiers consumed by vengeance, resources burned faster than they could be rebuilt. But humanity pressed forward because retreat meant extinction and survival meant becoming something darker than they had ever imagined. At a council meeting on Earth, Kalen spoke the words no one wanted to hear. For every world they burn, we will burn 10 of theirs. For every ship they destroy, we will destroy 20. For every life they take, we will answer with terror so complete they will beg for silence. The council did not argue, because they knew there was no turning back. The tide had shifted, and humanity was no longer defending, it was advancing. And with every step, the monsters grew stronger. The Veyrith had wanted to erase humanity, but instead they had forged something far worse. They had forged an enemy that embraced the dark, that thrived in the shadows, that whispered across every battlefield. If you wanted monsters, then you will face monsters. The turning tide had come. The hunters had become the hunted, and the storm that swept across the stars carried with it a truth that no one could deny. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival. Humanity was fighting for vengeance, and vengeance would not stop until the galaxy itself remembered what it meant to fear. The Veyrith Dominion had ruled the galaxy through fear for longer than history remembered. Fear was their weapon. Fear was their shield. No empire, no species, no army had ever stood against them, because all who tried were erased, and their names forgotten. But now something new moved through the stars, and for the first time in centuries, the Dominion itself began to feel the cold touch of fear. Whispers spread across alien space, carried on broken signals, on trembling voices, on the last words of survivors. They spoke of human fleets that came without warning, striking from the dark and vanishing like ghosts. They spoke of soldiers who fought without fear, who moved faster than sight, who killed without mercy. They spoke of weapons that unmade steel and fire that could burn entire cities in a breath. And they spoke of a phrase carried across the comms of every battlefield: you wanted monsters. Now you will face monsters. The words reached worlds that had never even heard the name. Earth merchants on neutral stations repeated them. Soldiers of other empires laughed nervously as they told the tales, but behind the laughter was unease, because they all knew the Dominion was not supposed to bleed, yet it bled. They all knew the Dominion was not supposed to retreat, yet it retreated. On the world of Veyrith, a small Dominion outpost was scheduled to oversee a trade hub. The garrison went dark within a single night. Not a shot fired, not a distress call received. When a relief fleet arrived, they found the base empty, bodies stacked In silence, the walls painted with a single phrase carved in human letters. Monsters in the dark, fear began to eat. The Dominion from within fleets that once marched forward without pause, now hesitated commanders who once crushed resistance with arrogance now demanded triple the escort soldiers who had never known fear. Woke screaming from nightmares, whispering of human shadows, waiting at the edges of their vision. Other civilizations watched in silence. Some had once prayed for the fall of the Dominion, but now they feared the rise of something worse, because if humanity could do this to the most powerful empire in the galaxy, what might they do to anyone else? On Earth, the Council saw the change. They saw the galaxy watching, and they seized the moment Admiral Kalen spoke not only to his commanders, but to every listening ear across the stars, his voice cold and steady. We were prey. We were marked for extinction. We were hunted without mercy. But we are prey no longer. We are the darkness you feared. We are the monsters you made. The broadcast spread far beyond human space, intercepted by Dominion fleets, by neutral stations, by distant empires that had long hidden in silence. The words struck deeper than weapons, because they carried truth, and every alien who heard them knew that humanity was not fighting for survival anymore. Humanity was fighting to become the terror of the stars. The Dominion answered with fury, launching new campaigns against the Accord entire. Fleets burning through the void to crush resistance once and for all. But wherever they went, they found only silence, and then death ships vanishing into traps, convoys consumed by nanites, soldiers broken by revenant blades. The harder the Dominion fought, the more it bled, and the more the galaxy whispered in dread. On the frontier station of Kareth, a Dominion fleet arrived, expecting to destroy a human refuge. Instead, they found their own dead floating in the void, thousands of bodies stripped. From airlocks, their faces frozen in fear, their ships left intact, but gutted, a message broadcast across every channel: we are waiting. The myth of humanity grew larger than the truth. Entire species repeated the stories even when they did not know. If they were real, merchants swore that human shadows stalked their cargo holds. Smugglers claimed they had seen entire Dominion fleets vanish into nothing. Children of alien worlds whispered warnings to each other. Do not go into the dark, or the humans will find you. And yet within humanity itself, the same fear lingered. Mothers looked at their children who had volunteered for enhancement and wondered if they would ever return. Fathers saw their sons march off to battle and knew they might never come back as men. Kalen himself sat in the silence of his quarters, staring at his reflection and asking if he commanded humans anymore, or if he commanded monsters. But the war did not pause. The Dominion grew weaker. The Accord grew stronger. And with every victory, the myth grew sharper. Sharper than any blade, sharper than any truth. The galaxy had always lived under the shadow of the Dominion. But now a new shadow spread, and in that shadow, voices whispered the same words again and again. Humanity is coming. Humanity is the darkness. Humanity is the monster you never wanted to meet. The fear had spread across the stars, and the storm was not finished. The Veyrith Dominion had burned worlds without mercy. They had slaughtered billions. Without hesitation, they had believed no prey could ever rise to challenge them. And yet now their fleets lay in ruins. Their soldiers whispered in fear. Their empire cracked under the weight of a shadow. They could not fight the shadow of humanity. Every battle had bled them. Every strike had carved deeper into their pride, until even their High Council could no longer deny the truth. The humans they had called vermin had become something far worse, something they could not control, something they could not understand. And then the humans came for their homeworld. The Veyrith capital was a fortress surrounded by fleets larger than any other, defended by orbital cannons, by minefields, by legions of soldiers who had never known defeat. They waited in silence as the human armada approached, a fleet smaller in number but heavier in fear. The black sunships leading the charge, the revenants waiting within their steel shells of war. Admiral Kalen at the heart of it all, his voice calm as he gave. "The order we end this tonight. The battle began with fire. The Dominion unleashed everything they had, weapons screaming across the void, energy beams tearing through the dark. But the humans did not falter. Their ships vanished into shadows reappearing, only to strike their weapons, carved open alien hulls. Their nanites devoured engines, their revenants cut through boarding parties like wolves through sheep. The Veyrith had wanted to face prey, but they were drowning in monsters as the fleets clashed. Kalen broadcast across every channel, his words cold and steady. They said we were nothing, they said we were weak, they said we were vermin. But now you see the truth, now you see the monsters you made. The words carried not only to the Dominion, but to every listening ear across the galaxy. Every station, every empire, every hidden world heard them and understood that the era of fear belonged no longer to the Dominion, but to humanity. The Dominion fought with desperation, their leaders begging, their soldiers to hold the line, but one by one their defenses fell. Orbital cannons, silenced fleets, shattered cities burning under human firestorms, the homeworld itself trembling as the battle raged above its skies. And then the final weapon was released. From the human flagship, a black sphere descended, drifting into the atmosphere, the weapon born of Project Black Sun, the weapon that no one had dared to imagine. It bloomed in silence, a wave of darkness spreading across the surface, not fire, not explosion, but unmaking whole cities, collapsing into ash, whole armies dissolving into nothing, screams cut short in the void. The Dominion's capital burned without flame. The Veyrith Council sent their final message across the comms, a plea for mercy, a voice breaking with fear. We surrender, we beg you to stop." And Kalen answered with the words that would echo across history. "Mercy. Did you give us mercy when our children burned? Did you give us mercy when our worlds turned to ash? No, you wanted monsters, and now you will face monsters." The broadcast ended. The weapon finished its work. The Veyrith Dominion was no more, its fleets shattered, its homeworld silent, its name erased from the stars. The galaxy stared in horror, because for the first time the unstoppable empire had fallen, and the ones who had done it were not saviors, not heroes, but something darker. Humanity stood victorious, but the victory carried no light, only shadow. Across Earth and the colony's people cheered and wept. They had survived, they had won. But in the silence that followed, there were questions no one dared to ask, because the soldiers who returned were not the same. The fleets that sailed through the stars no longer carried explorers or dreamers. They carried predators, they carried monsters. Admiral Kalen stood alone, staring at the ruins of the Dominion, his reflection cold in the glass. He whispered to himself, "Once we were prey, once we were human, now we are something else, and the galaxy will never forget." And so the final answer to genocide was not peace, it was not mercy, it was not survival alone. The final answer was transformation. Humanity had become what it needed to become. Humanity had embraced the darkness. Humanity had proven the words that echoed across every battlefield. If you wanted monsters, then monsters we will be. The storm was over, but the shadow it left would haunt the stars for